All right, everyone, welcome to our 2022 special webinar series. My name is Colleen. I'm with the New York Council on Problem Gambling. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can reach out to me. I labeled myself staff if you have any questions. So today we are talking about developing discrepancy between the past and present, leveraging nostalgic reverie to facilitate behavior change among those engaged in addictive behavior with Dr. Michael Wohl. Afterwards, we will explain the course evaluations. You'll get your certificates. So I'm going to let Dr. Wohl take it away.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and hopefully you can see my slides. First off, thank you to NYCPG for asking me to speak once again. The last time I spoke about forgiveness, and it was a wonderful experience, in part because the audience was so engaged, and I hope that the same happens today. And thank you all for tuning in. And I see that there's around 42 people in the room. Maybe more people will show up. I know that webinars can kind of be a bummer. We're all, I think, growing tired of the Zoom life. And there's a tendency to just sit back and just listen. But I'm here to challenge you today. And I want you to think about the session as if we were having, if we were at like a coffee shop, sipping overpriced coffee and just chatting away about behavior change. So I've never wanted to be a talking head. I don't want to just be standing, or sitting, as the case may be, in front of you for the next hour. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your virtual hand. I'm not sure that I'll be able to see your real hand if you just put up your real hand. And let's have a back and forth. I don't see any point in waiting till the end of the hour to bring up a question that arose 45 minutes earlier, and everybody's trying to remember what the heck the issue was that we were discussing at the time. I may have to cut off conversation at some point just to make sure that we have time to cover everything that I'd ideally like to cover today. But let's have a conversation, right? So again, don't be afraid to unmute yourself. Don't be afraid to keep your camera on, so I'm not just talking into a void. Before I begin, I do want to warn you that there will be some stats presented, but those are really just for the stats savvy folk that want to see numbers. So if you're not familiar with what a p-value is or what a confidence interval is, don't worry. I'll just be walking you through the results, and I'm going to try to keep it rather high level today. Okay. With that said, let's start. So let's face it. I mean, behavior change is really hard. How many of you, if you want to raise your virtual hand, if not, that's okay, just think about it, have said to themselves that, that they want to exercise more this summer, maybe eat a little bit healthier, maybe stay awake during this presentation, but are having difficulty doing so. Now, those are rather, okay, good. I hope that's for wanting to eat healthier and that's not for trying to stay awake during this presentation. So thanks so much for raising your hand. Those kind of changes are rather mundane changes in the grand scheme of things. But what about addictive behavior like gambling? Most disordered gamblers, people who have issues with gambling, recognize the harm that their behavior is inflicting on themselves and others. Yet, only about 15% of people who need to change their behavior take the necessary actions to do so, and less than 1% seek professional care.
As he said.
So therapies that tend to focus on when we think about the broad array of therapies that exist, most of them tend to focus people on what they are doing right now, right? And then try to veer them to the future possible selves. What is it that you want to achieve? What are your goals in life? So they're juxtaposing the present self and the future. Okay, who is it that you want to become? What is your addictive behavior doing to undermine the person who you want to become? Now, let's just take a couple examples. Okay, let's take, for example, fantasy realization. Maybe you're familiar with fantasy realization, maybe you're not. But at the heart of fantasy realization is getting the client to fantasize about their desired future, okay? Who is it that you want to become? And then what are your chances of success? And how do you go about achieving that end? So again, there's very much of a future focus, right? And that is what's used to motivate behavior change. Maybe a treatment modality that you're more familiar with is motivational interviewing, okay? And here, once again, the goal of motivational interviewing is to reduce or minimize resistance to change. And what the treatment provider typically does is explores a discrepancy between what the client is doing right now, right, and the goals that the person has for their future. What is it that you want to become? And then reduce the ambivalence towards change, right? Why might there be ambivalence? Well, because people do reap benefits, right, from engaging in the addictive behavior. You know, maybe it's just coping with negative life situations. So they're using it to cope. They don't want to relinquish that means to cope with their negative life situation. And then the way that the treatment provider does this is by getting people to set goals about the future. Okay, so it allows clients to see how the problem might be at odds with their hopes for the future. Again, underscoring the future. Now, what's going on here is that you're trying to get people to create what social psychologists call self-continuity, building up the connection between who they are, who they think that they are, and the future self, okay? And that there's a core aspect of that individual that traverses time and space that the addictive behavior is undermining, okay? Let me use more sort of concrete examples to underscore the notion of self-continuity, because it's an important concept that's going to take us through this entire hour, okay? Here is me today, or at least when I was able to be in my gambling lab at Carleton University in the before times. So this is me now. In psychological terms, we want to we want to think that there's a core self that traverses time and space. So here's Michael at about 8 years old, then Michael at about 10, 12 years old, and then Michael today. And we believe that there's a core, or we tend to believe there's a core self or core Michael that traverses time and space. And that projects into who we want to be in the future, okay? This is where, you know, hopefully you're not laughing at my desire to be a Nobel scholar here. But what happens is that addictive behavior can undermine that, right? It creates a discontinuity with the self, or who that core aspect is, that core Michael that traverses time and space. And since there is a cut in the continuity, then it can undermine who it is, your goals for the future. Okay, this is an important concept. So does anybody have any questions about this core concept before we move forward about what self-continuity is? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we'll continue. The addiction, just one more time, the addiction is framed as undermining who one wants to become. That is, there's a focus on the future self and how we can get the client back on course so that she or he is who she wanted to become. And listen, at some level, this makes a whole heck of a lot of sense, okay? To focus people on the future, what the future might hold without, say, problem gambling in their life. And research has shown that people who feel continuous, who feel this connection between the past self and the present self and thinking about the future self, that they tend to have higher self-esteem, purpose in life, and are healthier. But what happens when you focus a client who is living with addiction on a future without the addictive behavior or substance? I'm assuming that there's a lot of treatment providers in the room. Can you tell me, one person, maybe unmute yourself, if you're dealing with a client who's currently dealing with an addictive behavior, let's say gambling, and then say this is the first time that they've come to see you, and you focus them on the future without, say, gambling or another substance in their life. Does anybody want to? A lot of fear. Thank you for whomever just unmuted. Fear, anxiety. They tend to get really anxious. Why? Because there's a reason why they were gambling. There's a reason why they were using, and many people end up using that gambling or substance in order to cope. And although they know that behavior is creating some harm, life without that behavior can sometimes be very anxiety provoking, especially if, say, their friendship circle their friends also gamble, or their friends also use. That means that you're ripping them out of what they perceive as their friendship network. It can create a lot of anxiety. Okay, I really like this quote by Charles Darwin. As for a future life, every man must judge for himself between conflicting vague possibilities. What does he mean by that, and how am I using it? Well, people living with addiction have a hard time envisioning the future. Okay? They have a very difficult time envisioning the future. What they want a better life, but what it's going to look like without that behavior in their life can be very anxiety provoking. And so this is a major hurdle for treatment providers. Okay. Now, critical to recovery is the recognition that addictive behavior has changed the self. Right? That in gambling problematically, using a substance can fundamentally alter one's sense of self. Okay. Now, this is where most treatment modalities will focus people on the future. But again, the future is very vague. think about what your life is going to be like in a year from now. We don't know. We haven't lived it. Now think about, you're now asking the client to remove a behavior that has, although it's created problems, has provided them some semblance of comfort. This can be very problematic. So what my colleagues and I have argued, okay, is that perhaps what we should be doing is focusing people who are living with addiction, disordered gamblers, on the past self, specifically the self that existed before the addiction took hold. Okay, who were you? What was your life like? And then trying to use the past as leverage to motivate people to engage in change. It's hard to envision what your life will be without the addictive behavior. But if you can remember what your life was like before the addictive behavior, then that might motivate people to try to reclaim the past. So what we have tried to do in our research is highlight how the addictive behavior, specifically disordered gambling, has created a disconnection in the self, a discontinuity in the self, and trying to leverage that to facilitate behavior change. Now, why might discontinuity, highlighting that the addictive behavior has created a discontinuity, influence behavior change or motivate behavior change? Because self-discontinuity tends to elicit nostalgic reverie, sentimental longing for the past. Okay, and it's nostalgizing that tends to lead people to want to reclaim the past. It's the reason why I buy my 8-year-old Transformers. Okay, it's not because I think necessarily he'll enjoy it. I hope he'll enjoy playing with Transformers. It's the nostalgic reverie from my past, right? I'm trying to regain part of my past through my son. And it's the same reason why you might have bought, if you have children, bought, things from your past for your kid. You're trying to reclaim the past. Nostalgia is motivating in that we try to reclaim the past. Okay, so if we can leverage the past, if we can highlight self-discontinuity among people who are engaging in addictive behavior, that self-discontinuity should elicit nostalgic reverie for that pre-addicted self. And when people are nostalgizing about the past, they'll want to reclaim it. Okay, to use a more political-oriented example, Trump's Make America Great Again is trying to elicit nostalgic reverie for a past. Okay, and then why that's so effective is that people who buy into that narrative want to reclaim that past. And so what we are trying to do is see whether nostalgic reverie for the pre-addicted self can motivate behavior change. And there is an increasing body of literature showing the benefits of nostalgia for the self. Okay, people who nostalgize for their past, it increases positive self-regard. Okay, so they think more highly of themselves. Okay, it creates a greater sense of belonging. So when people think back, and this is also critical for addictive behavior, you think about the social connections that you had, right, before you engaged in the addictive behavior. And people want to reclaim those social connections and that feeling of belongingness. it reduces anxiety, and it helps restore continuity. So by highlighting discontinuity, it ends up eliciting continuity. Here's a quote that I think really hammers it home nicely. Nostalgia is the suffering caused by an unappeased yearning to return. Again, nostalgia, when you nostalgize, you want to return. So if you can get people to nostalgize for the life that they had before the addictive behavior took hold, you should be able to motivate behavior change. And so the model that we're working with here today is the following. Here's readiness to change. How can you promote it? You should be able to promote it by increasing self-discontinuity. Why will self-discontinuity create behavior change? Because it elicits nostalgia. And it's the nostalgia, not the self-discontinuity. It's the nostalgia that's elicited through discontinuity that should elicit readiness to change. Okay. Now, do we have any questions? Because I'm about to jump into some data to substantiate my claims here.
How can this relate to people who say gamble to escape their past?
That is an excellent question. And so what I'll show you near the end of the presentation are some boundary conditions to the effect. But what we have found is that even people who are trying to escape their past and are using gambling to cope, that there is some part of their life, either before they were gambling problematically, or maybe there was a lull where they were gambling problematically and then they reduced their gambling. And they felt a sense of safety or security during that time. And then what you want to do is bridge them to that time in the past. Remember, the reason why the past can be so effective is that they lived it, right? Most people have a time in their past when they felt more safe, when they felt more secure. And then you can leverage that time and ask the client, well, what were you doing during that time? In all likelihood, they weren't using as much. They weren't gambling as much. And there's a reality aspect to it. It's like, okay, well, what were you doing? Oh, well, I had a job. Okay, well, what can we put in place to recreate that time in your past when you felt more safe and secure? Maybe it was that you were gambling less. You had a secure job. That is tangible. The future is not tangible. It's anxiety provoking. It's a lot of ifs. It's a lot of, well, if this happened, maybe this will occur. They haven't lived the future yet. They've lived their past. And so that's why I argue, and I'll show you some data very, in the next slide, that underscores this point. But I will go through some of the boundary conditions of this effect near the end of the talk. Does that make sense? Okay, great.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So one of the first studies that we did is that we wanted to see if we could prime nostalgia, if we could elicit nostalgia through highlighting discontinuity. And so we recruited disordered gamblers, and we either primed them with discontinuity, and I'll show you how we did it, or self-continuity. And then we measured nostalgia and readiness to change. So this was a very simple manipulation. We had people read a little blurb that either said that gambling can fundamentally alter your sense of self, or it doesn't change your sense of self, right? And that we then said, please write how this is true for you. So what we're trying to do is create people a sense of discontinuity, that this behavior that I'm engaged in has fundamentally altered who I am or not, okay? And what we see is that I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from people in the discontinuity condition. So they said things like, gambling has eroded every fiber of my being. Before gambling, I was always happy. After entering the casino and winning my first night, it caught me in an endless cycle of pain. So here in the discontinuity condition, we're seeing that people were seeing that gambling has fundamentally altered them or altered their life. And what we find here is that, again, here's the first stats. Don't worry about it. If bar graphs aren't your thing, I'll walk you through it, okay? So just listen to my voice if this isn't helpful for you. What we see is that there was greater nostalgia in the self-discontinuity condition than in the continuity condition. And importantly, we also see greater readiness to change in the discontinuity condition than the continuity condition. And then statistically, what we showed is that self-discontinuity led to readiness to change, okay, because it went through nostalgia. Again, don't worry about this graph if it confuses you with the numbers. All I want you to do is take a look at the fact that when we were able to highlight discontinuity, that is that gambling had altered one's sense of self, that elicited nostalgia for the time before gambling was problematic, and that heightened their readiness to change. Okay. Now, of course, there's often a large chasm between recognizing that behavior change is needed and being ready to change and actually taking the necessary steps to change your behavior. I really like this quote, that change is the antithesis of addiction, right? Change is really hard. And even though you may want to change, even though you may recognize that your gambling has become very problematic, taking those steps to change your behavior is a big, big step, okay? Now, to hammer this home, how many of you set a New Year's resolution last year? If you can remember December 2021, right? Maybe raise your hands. How many of you set a New Year's resolution? Okay. Well, okay, one person. Thank you, Lynn. Research shows that about 40 to 50% of American adults participate in this annual tradition of making New Year's resolutions. What percentage of people do you think have kept their New Year's resolution 1 year later? Somebody just unmute yourself. Tell me a percentage out of 100.
A couple in the chat, 10%, 15, 25.
Oh, right, there's the chat. Sorry, I don't see the chat. I'm just talking
No,
away.
that's okay. I can keep an eye on it.
Okay, so you're pretty close. Only about 19% of people kept their resolution a year later. Okay, 19%. Okay, and often these resolutions are rather mundane. Now think about people engaged in addictive behavior. Again, behavior change is really hard. So what we needed to do next is to assess whether or not this nostalgia induced via discontinuity elicits behavior change. And so we replicated the study that I just showed you, but then we were like, we need to follow these people up, right? So we called the people back 1 month later to assess whether or not they had attempted change in the month since we highlighted that discontinuity among them, the self-discontinuity. So what we found is that indeed, once again, this self-discontinuity led to nostalgia, which increased readiness to change. Now, you might be wondering what this thing is, this PG severity, that's problem gambling severity. What we found is that this model only worked for people who had elevated levels of problem gambling severity. And again, this makes sense because people who are low, they don't need to change, right? They don't need to change their behavior. It's only the people who are showing signs of disordered gambling that need to change their behavior. And what we found is that highlighting discontinuity ended up eliciting nostalgia, which increased their readiness to change. Now, what's really important here is that it also ended up influencing attempted change a month later. So among the people, specifically the disordered gamblers in our sample, when we highlighted how gambling had fundamentally altered their sense of self, it ended up eliciting nostalgic reverie for their pre-addicted self, which ended up leading to change attempts over the 1 month period that they were in our study. Now I'll show you one more study along these lines. We want to see, does this extend to other risky behaviors like problem drinking? And in fact, it did, okay? So once again, we highlighted how drinking can fundamentally alter your sense of self. This increased nostalgic reverie for the pre-addicted self, okay? And then that ended up influencing attempted change. Okay, don't worry about that. So the next thing that I wanted to show you, okay, you might be saying, okay, well, this nostalgia thing, this seems cool, okay, or maybe I don't believe it. Let me highlight something else for you here, okay? And that is, well, we want to say, well, how does nostalgia stack up against known barriers to change? Okay, things that you might be familiar with, like shame and guilt, or various motives for engaging in the addictive behavior, like coping motives. And so what we did is that we recruited more disordered gamblers, so over 200 disordered gamblers, and we had them complete an array of different measures, okay, including how much they're nostalgic for their life before the addictive behavior took hold. And we also measured the extent to which they felt shame, their coping motives. Now, again, I'm going to show you a stats slide in a second. Don't worry about it. I will walk you through it, okay? So don't worry about the numbers. The numbers are only there for people who want to see what the numbers are. When we looked at things like, we asked them, have you tried to change your behavior, change your gambling? What we see here is that things like coping, shame, so people who gamble in order to cope, they tend to not want to change their gambling behavior. That shame and guilt tend to undermine change behavior. Okay, these are typically significantly negative associations with readiness to change. What we found is that nostalgia overwhelms all of those other known barriers to change. And in fact, what we found here, the reason why it's bolded, is that nostalgia was a positive predictor of change. Not only did it overwhelm all the other known barriers to change, we found that nostalgia facilitated the desire to change. And it's really strong, right? This, if you know anything about stats, an odds ratio of 2.48 is really strong. We also asked them, have you sought professional help? And here, once again, we find that nostalgia is the strongest predictor over and above other known barriers, over and above known barriers to change. And here, nostalgia is a facilitator of change. Okay. So now let's go to that question that I said that we would address at the beginning. So when somebody asked, well, what about coping motives, right? Is this good for everybody? And I've got to say the answer is no, right? There are limits and boundaries. It's not a panacea. It's not a cure-all, okay? We do know that there are some barriers, okay? And so as people who are wanting to change or helping those to change, if there's treatment providers in the room, and I'm sure that there are, I need to let you know about some of the barriers to this very strong effect of nostalgizing. Now, before I go on to the barriers, I do want to underscore that I've been doing research now. I'm now in close to doing research on behavior change and addiction for about 25 years, 26 years. I've never seen such a consistent and consistently powerful effect as nostalgia for facilitating behavior change. It is incredibly powerful, and I have never not found the effect. There has always been a correlation in every study that I've done between nostalgizing for the pre-addicted self and an increased desire in behavior change, okay? But there are some barriers, some restrictions. The first restriction that I want to talk to you about today is mindset, or what's called implicit theories of behavior. And what this is all about is that according to Carol Dweck, who's a professor of psychology at Stanford, she's been doing this research for a long, long time. And what she's found is there tends to be two types of people, although they exist on a continuum. There are people who believe that change is possible, and those are incremental theorists. And then there are people who believe that behavior is fixed. And those people are what are called entity theorists. Know, though, that it exists on a continuum. So people aren't either one or the other, they can be somewhere in the middle, but all people tend to believe that behavior is either somewhat more malleable or somewhat more fixed. And where Carol Dweck started doing her research is on intelligence. And what she found is that people, like if you teach a kid, okay, that they're smart, right? As opposed to try harder, they actually do more poorly, okay? That you really want to instill in people the idea that behavior is malleable. That's why I never tell my son, his name is Asher, I never say, Asher, you're such a smart kid. I try to instill in him, the more you try, the better you get. That behavior is malleable. Intelligence is malleable, okay? That is extremely important. But there are also people who have a tendency to believe that their behavior is fixed. Now, what's important also, though, that research by Carol Dweck, as well as myself and others have shown, is that you can change people's mindset. So even though some people tend to believe that that behavior is fixed, you can manipulate that. You can train people into a more incremental mindset. Okay. Now, what we were wondering is, how does that play out in behavior change, especially for people who are engaged in addictive behavior, right? So maybe an entity having an entity theories, that is that my behavior can't change, is really going to undermine behavior change. And so for the treatment providers in the room, I really encourage you to try to suss this out with among your clients. Are your clients more on the incremental side? And if so, you're going to have an easier time at changing their behavior because they believe that that behavior is malleable. If they're more on the entity side of the spectrum, you're going to have a tougher time. And then part of your task would be to try to move people towards more of that incremental mindset and showing people that their behavior can change, that people's behavior can change. Now let's go to the topic today. What we were wondering about is whether this implicit theory, okay, can undermine the nostalgia attempted change link, especially for people who are entity theorists, who believe that their behavior can't change. Because for those people, even if you're nostalgizing about what your life used to be before the addictive behavior took hold, entity theorists will have a tendency to believe that they can't reclaim that past, okay? That they can't change their behavior, that they can't bring the behavior back into the present. And so we wanted to test this, okay? And so in the sake of time, again, I'm going to show you a line graph. Don't worry about it if this is something that you're going to have, that you might have time wrapping your head around. I'll walk you through it. So the first line I'm going to show you is the incremental theorists. And what we see here, so this is who attempted change. So there was a greater likelihood for people in the high nostalgia condition, so in the nostalgic reverie condition, who are incremental theorists, who believe that their behavior can change, they're the ones who attempted change, okay? In the low nostalgic condition, they didn't change their behavior, okay? Now I'm gonna present a line that might bend your noodle for a second, but again, don't worry, I will walk you through it. What we see here with entity theorists is that there's a flat, okay? So nostalgia did nothing. Whether or not you were low or high, if you're an entity theorist, it didn't do anything for your attempted change, okay? Why? They're flatlined. They don't believe that change can happen. So it's very hard to move entity theorists. Now, what you might be saying, maybe you're one step ahead of me here, okay? What we're seeing here is that the greatest amount of change happened among people who believe that change can happen, and we highlighted nostalgic reverie among them. Now, you might be saying, what the heck is with this group, right? They believe that change can happen, but when they're not feeling nostalgic for the past, there's almost no change that happens. And this was very interesting to us, and we did pursue it. And one of what we found is that when you're an incremental theorist and you're not nostalgizing for the past, right? They tend to believe that change can happen at any time, so they don't need to put in the effort, right? They believe that change can happen at any time, so they don't need to put in the effort. It's only when we highlighted the nostalgia, when we made them nostalgize for their past, that's what motivated these people. They went, okay, I need to change now because I want to reclaim that past. When they weren't focused on that past, that better past, they didn't change their behavior. Okay. Now, again, we're still trying to find sort of the limits and boundaries of this effect. And we do believe that there are some people where a future focus might be beneficial, okay, over a past focus, right? All that we've been talking about for the last 40 some odd minutes is how the past can be used to leverage, can be leveraged to facilitate a better future. Okay. But we did think, okay, we're like, oh, well, wait a second. There might be some people who a future focus is better. So in another study, half of our participants, we asked them to write about a lived experience before gambling, before the addictive behavior took hold. And for another group of participants, we asked them to write about their anticipated or hoped for future when they are no longer gambling. The next slide, I'm going to just show you the results from the past focused folk. Okay. What we found, we did a qualitative analysis and we found two clusters of participants. The first cluster were able to generate a positive past for themselves. They said life was better before gambling took hold. I had better social connections. I was involved in more activities. I was a better person. There was another group of people who said, no, I had a difficult past. Gambling has not changed my quality, has not changed the quality of my life. Parts of my past were negative, and that I will not change my gambling, okay? What we found here, okay, most importantly, is that readiness to change was higher for the cluster 1 people than the cluster 2 people. I think it was Lynn who unmuted and was asking about people who had a difficult past or used gambling to cope. What we find is that there's in fact 2 groups of people, those who can think about a positive past before gambling took hold, and those who had a very difficult past and can't think or find it difficult to think of a positive time in their life before gambling took hold, problem gambling took hold. In terms of the future focus condition, again, we found 2 clusters of participants. One who was optimistic about the future, saying, I'll be happier, my finances will be better, I will engage in more activities. And cluster 2, who are more ambivalent about the future. So saying parts of my life will be better, but parts will be worse, right? And those who were more resistant to change. Once again, critical here is that it was the cluster 1 participants who were optimistic about the future. They had a greater desire for change. So what's the take-home message here? The take-home message here is that the past focus may be effective. So trying to elicit nostalgic reverie, okay, might be easier when with your client if they believe that they had a positive past or there were positive aspects of their past that they want to reclaim, and those who may be a little bit ambivalent or anxious about the future. For those people, you may want to use the past. The past and trying to elicit nostalgic reverie will be more helpful to you as a treatment provider than focusing them on the future per se. Now, other clients, though, it may be easier for you to focus on the future. Who are those people? Well, those people who anticipate a positive future. Those who want to work towards a better future, and the future is more of a goal for them. And they have a clear understanding of what the future will look like. The future isn't vague. The future isn't anxiety provoking. As soon as a client talks to you about how the future is very anxiety provoking, you may want to focus on the past and leveraging discontinuity and trying to elicit nostalgia, okay? The future is better for those who anticipate a positive future and who have a difficult past or who express a difficult past. Now, before I leave you today, I see that we're close to the end of the time that I have for you. I want to talk to you a little bit about nostalgizing and the recovery process. This is hot off the presses research that I'm presenting to you today. This is unpublished research, but research that is currently undergoing peer review at an academic journal. And I'll tell you a story. This idea didn't come from my brain. I had an honors student come to me and said, you know, listen, Michael, you're showing time and time again the benefits of nostalgizing. Yes, you're seeing some limits and boundaries, but if you want to promote behavior change, nostalgic reverie seems to be a way to promote behavior change. But what about people who've already started the recovery process? What about people who have stopped gambling, right? How does nostalgia play into the recovery process? And where she was coming from, and the she is Mackenzie Dawson, who's now one of my master's students, she was saying, hey, listen, a lot of gamblers who have gone through treatment or going through treatment and have stopped gambling. And one of her interests is people who are living with an eating disorder and have gone through treatment and are in the recovery process. Many of those people may nostalgize about the unhealthy behavior that they were engaged in, okay? For them, the memory of the benefits they got from the eating disorder or the excitement that they got from gambling, they may nostalgize about that, and they may be intoxicated by the memory of the benefits that they reaped from it, okay? So here in gambling, we know that, that gamblers tend to reap some, they express that they get some benefits from the unhealthy behavior, the excitement from gambling, the social interactions that they have at the table or with the pit boss, or when they go to a casino and they meet the people who are there and they become friends with the other gamblers, and the positive affect that they get from winning. People in recovery might actually, nostalgizing might undermine their recovery process. And so here, what we were looking at was how does it influence recovery? And so again, this is hot off the presses work. What we found is people who felt a sense of discontinuity, and here the discontinuity is the recovered self and the self when they were gambling. And once again, we see this connection between self-discontinuity and nostalgizing. But now it's nostalgizing for the benefits that they reaped from engaging in the unhealthy behavior, okay? And what we found is to the extent that the people in recovery are nostalgizing for the benefits that they reaped from the unhealthy behavior, it undermined their subjective sense of recovery. That is, that they felt that they were earlier in the recovery process. And what we're finding in a study that we just finished about a month ago is that these individuals are more likely to relapse, okay? So nostalgizing for the benefits, again, if you're a treatment provider, one of the critical factors that I'd ask you to look into is, are your clients nostalgizing for the benefits that they reaped from engaging in the addictive behavior? And there, it may be a sign that they are going, that the odds that they're going to relapse are likely higher, okay? So what are the takeaway messages? I see that I'm very close to the end of my time, if not right at the end of my time. what I want you to take home from this hour is that facilitating people to see the past self as different and better motivates behavior change. Why? Because if you can anchor them in the past, it's tangible. They lived that life. And if you can find a time in the client's past where they were happy and healthier, you can then use that as leverage to have them think, well, what were you doing? What did you have in your life during that time? And let's work to recreate that in the present. That's going to be less anxiety provoking because it's tangible for them. And these small little changes can have very significant downstream effect in terms of their health and well-being. But again, nostalgia is not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. There are limits and boundaries of this effect. And if your client has stopped engaging in the unhealthy behavior, stopped gambling, you may want to see and suss the extent to which they're nostalgizing for the addictive behavior and find ways to undermine that and maybe ask them to go even further back, right, to the time before they were gambling, or anchoring them on, well, what are you doing now? Yeah, you might be nostalgizing for the benefits, but also look at all that is going right for you now that you have stopped. Now, of course, there's no I in team. Here's some of my team members, Kenzie, and Bella, who are doing the work on those in recovery, and Andrew Kim, who I started this work on nostalgia with, as well as Melissa Salmon and some colleagues at the University of Southampton. So with that, I thank you for your time, and hopefully we still have some time for questions.
We have about 3 minutes left. I just want to thank you, Dr. Wohl, for your time today. And I do just want to let everybody know they will get an email with instructions on how to fill out their evaluations and get their certificates.
Thank you.
Yeah, and like I said, you have 3 minutes if anybody has some questions.
Sure. Hopefully this was enlightening. Hopefully this was a different way of seeing behavior change and a different variable that perhaps you hadn't been thinking about. Does anybody have any questions for me? Feel free to unmute yourself, because unfortunately I'm not monitoring the chat.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Because this sounds like looking at one's traditions, where they might have been very positive, and the client has disassociated from those traditions. Is that what you're kind of alluding to?
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because I've just got a grant to study what is called the social cure with my colleague Kath Haslam at the University of Queensland. I encourage you to read on the social cure. And what that is, that line of research is about how social connectedness and social group membership can help facilitate behavior change. And so what we're looking at is we're going to be running some studies looking at nostalgia for those social connections that you had before the addiction took hold, and feeling connected to your community, and how that can be used to leverage behavior change. That if you believe that your behavior has severed those, maybe changing the behavior will help you reclaim those. So yeah, if you're looking for other stuff to read, there's a wonderful book called The New Psychology of Health, which is really about the social cure. There's an American Scientific American article on the social cure. I can send along should you want to take a look at it. I think, Robert, that research is very much in line with what you're talking about. So feel free to reach out to me. I can send you that article. But yes, we see these things as connected, right? That if you're nostalgizing for that, you'll want to reclaim that.
Quick question, Valerie Fain here.
Valerie.
Do you see that age has any factor in this?
Really great question, because I'm guessing you're thinking that perhaps people who are older will have more to nostalgize about. Maybe that's where you're going with it. We're not finding age is a factor here. That if you're 20, if you're 18, if you're 50, hopefully there's a time in your past where you felt safe, when you felt more secure, before you engaged in that addictive behavior. Now, we are finding that some clients do tell us, and some participants, that they can't remember that they started gambling when they were 8 or 9, or they started drinking when they were 8 or 9, and they can't remember a time before that.
Mm-hmm.
But what we've found is that when you come up against that barrier, when we push them, we say, okay, but was there a time in your life where you weren't using as much, when you weren't gambling as much? And most people do say yes. And then we say, okay, well, what was going on in your life? Well, so I remember, I know that we're at over 1 o'clock, but if you'll let me tell this story. I gave a talk on nostalgia at a treatment center in Hamilton, Ontario. And afterwards, I had a client come up to me and said, this is really interesting, but I think it's bullshit, because I can't remember a time before gambling, and I can't remember a time before drinking. And my immediate response was, oh crap, right? And through chatting with him, I said, well, listen, was there ever a time where you weren't gambling as much, right? Where you weren't drinking? Oh, and he also said to me, I'm a shitty human being. Like, I can't, my pre-addicted self, I don't want to reclaim that. I said, okay, but was there a time where you felt better about yourself? Yes. What was going on in your life? I had a girlfriend. Okay. Did you have a job? Yeah. Did you like your job? Yeah. Were you gambling as much? No. And then it was like the light bulb. Oh, okay. These things are correlated.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then starting to chat with him a little bit more about that, he ended up walking away going, I get it. And that's something I can sink my teeth into. I remember that time. He explicitly said, when I'm talking to treatment providers and they're telling me about my future, I'm saying, I don't think that future can ever happen. Or it scares me to think of a life without this in my life. But you've now anchored me in a time in my life where things were better. And now I can think about what I was doing, what was happening in my life. And I was happier back then. And I said, do you want to reclaim that time? And he said, well, I don't think I can reclaim that girlfriend. And I'm like, no, but maybe you can, if you put all the things in place in your life, like it wasn't the girlfriend that made you stop using, likely, it was you weren't using. And so then you had time in your life for a girlfriend. It's like, and you had a secure job? Yes. And it was an epiphany moment for him. And I do get emails from him still, him telling me, that really changed my frame of reference. And I'm hoping that does that for you as well, because I think that in most treatment modalities are obsessed with the future, and they poo-poo the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like, oh, that's, psychoanalysis, right? No, you just need to find a place in that person's life, in their past, where they were safe and secure, and things will follow. They'll want to reclaim that past because they're nostalgizing about that past.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. Lots of thank yous in the chat. Great topic. We will be doing a Facebook Live with Michael as well. If you're interested in this topic, an email will be getting sent out about it. It is May 19th at 7:30 p.m. But yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks so much for
Thank
your
you.
time. Don't be afraid to reach out.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.